This is our teaching video for the 15th Sunday after Pentecost entitled, Your Table is Ready. If you want to follow along, and of course you'll get the reason why it's called that if you read in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, starting with the first verse and then continuing with verses 7 through 14. And that's the story of Jesus having dinner at the house of a Pharisee. And then we're going to continue reading in the book of Hebrews, as we've done the last few weeks, Hebrews chapter 13, 1 through 8, and 15 through 16, and this will be very familiar. Even for people that don't know that much about the book of Hebrews, some of these verses are perhaps the most familiar. Well, for us to get started today, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 14 and this idea of the table at which Jesus finds himself. But before we really talk about the table, we're also going to have to talk about the seating chart. Because dining in the ancient world was not an egalitarian affair. Where you sat and who sat next to whom was an important indicator of value and status. And so Luke is writing for a more Gentile audience, and that means for people living in the Roman world. And people that would listen to these stories certainly were concerned with who sat where and what happened at dinner. And you don't necessarily need to know the cultural context to get the message that Jesus is giving, but I think it helps flesh it out. Seating charts and assigning value to seats is not unknown to us. This is a seating chart for Staples Center if you wanted to buy tickets there. And we know that you are not going to pay the same price for a courtside seat at a Lakers game as you are for a seat up near the Figueroa Street entrance in section 304, for example. And while we're used to seats having value at events, sporting events, concerts, and the like, normally at dinner we're not so much interested in who sits where. Maybe a formal dinner like a wedding, there might be assigned seats, but even then oftentimes you just take your name off the table and sit with whoever you want. And that's not the case for the time of Jesus and for the time of the Romans. Now, a lot of these pictures I'm showing you might be more accessible to the people hearing Luke's gospel than to us, and certainly the Jews had their own rituals on top of this, but this, I think, gives us a fairly safe boundary to play in. This is a traditional Roman table. We've talked about this before, especially during Holy Week when they have the Last Supper at a table like this. It's called a triclinium, which just means a three-sided table, and you'll notice that this concrete part has an angle down so that people can recline, but also kind of recline up towards the food. Now, the next thing I want to show you is actually a seating chart for these tables, so you can see who might sit where. Now, you could either have a three-sided table like we had that was built into the wall, or you might actually have three separate seating couches. And so you'll notice here that the person hosting the party, they recline here. The people who are the high status guests, they recline here. And those who are low status guests, they recline here. And so in fact, the tables would be different sizes in some cases, and really as you see down here, the view would be for the high status people. So the high status people not only had the best view, but they also were then able to talk to the host family easily and had the best position at the party. And so you'll notice when Jesus sees people going to the house, sometimes the person who would invite someone to a party wouldn't set up a seating chart because they didn't want to offend people or they didn't want to get into the morass of assigning social value. And so the guests would come and seat themselves. Now, if it turned out that there was a guest of a particularly high rank, you may be kicked off your couch to a lesser couch. And that's kind of some of the context that Jesus is talking about. So he's saying, don't put yourself too high. Don't think that you belong on the green couch when actually you're probably on the black couch. And of course, the very famous scene from the Gospels is when Jesus comes to this low status seat and does the washing of the feet. Jesus, who belongs here as the teacher, the guest of honor, no, he gives up the lectus medius and he comes down here to wash the feet. Now, this is all very important for how the people interacted together socially. Just for fun, I'm going to show you a few more pictures so you'll see this is what we're talking about. This would be the high status couch, the hosts, and low status. Notice the low status people, they don't get to see out the nice window. And we have preserved from Pompeii, this is actually a replicated room from Pompeii called House of the Moralist, and it actually has written on the walls instructions for people on their couches. This is the House of the Moralist in Pompeii, and then we'll go inside, and on the wall is written a warning to the guests. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to zoom in too much, but on these black panels, especially this one, they had some of the warnings. Unfortunately, in World War II, a bomb uh, ruined some of the pictures, but the warning here for the guests is, please do not make eyes at other people's wives. So maybe this is especially in the sight line of the people on the low status couch. Please do not make eyes at the wives of the other guests. Now, if we take into account that the banquet Jesus talks to us about is really God's table, and of course you hear resonance of that with Holy Communion, and table is now probably the popular term, but also altar is important for the meaning of the Eucharist. But if we were thinking of God throwing a meal, where would you sit on one of those three couches? What would be your place? And unfortunately, while human beings think very highly of themselves, the reality is there is no place for us at God's table, meaning that you would not get to go sit on the couch, especially the high status couch. You would probably be in the kitchen, one of the dirty slaves, having to work the dinner. And of course, Christianity sticks all of that hierarchy on its head, where the work of the slave and the servant is actually God's work. But you don't have a place, you don't have a status at God's table, at least automatically by your nature. And yet, the gift of the good news, and this is why it's called good news, is that God makes a place for us at the table. God makes us a place at the table. And it's not necessarily even the place of the servant, though that becomes the place we want to seek out to follow in Jesus' footsteps, but God gives you a high status place. And yet it's not a place that you deserve, so we can say that. It's not like God says, oh, it's you, I'm so happy you deserve to sit next to me. It's not a place you earn, it's a place that's gifted. And sometimes people forget the good news is a gift. What God has given you, you cannot repay. And so you may remember that line from the psalmist. Truly no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. That's from Psalm 47. So there's this sense that not only are you given a place at the table, but it's paid for. And of course, this gets into some of the theology of the cross. Jesus secures this place, and indeed the life is ransomed or redeemed with blood. And in fact, that role of ransoming or redeeming was oftentimes your close relative had to come and bail you out. And so Jesus comes and bails us out. But it's with a price that is priceless. So you can never make up for it. You can never say, okay, God, I've kind of given you back what you gave me. And so there's a sense of gratuity. And because God has been gratuitous with us, then one of our primary roles is to be grateful. And I just had lunch with someone this week who was talking about being at a stage of their life where they're just much more grateful. They recognize how fragile life can be, and they recognize all they've received, and now they're interested in giving back. And that's a very powerful attitude, gratuity leading to gratefulness. And so when we think about Holy Communion, and if you remember that word Eucharist actually just means thanksgiving. We're just so thankful, God, that you've given us what you've given us, and so we give you thanks. Now, if you take that and consider Jesus' words, then you can really put into perspective why he says, when you throw a meal, host people that can't repay you. When you hold a meal, host people that can't repay you. And I would love sometime in my ministry to do that. Host a really nice dinner and invite people who could never afford it or even repay you as a sign of this gift we've received. Wouldn't that be wonderful? An annual event at Grace Lutheran where we held a dinner like that, a very expensive, wonderful dinner. So those last verses that Jesus gives about throwing a party are the verses that indicate to us how our own lives begin to reflect the gift we've received. So we can say the gift has been given to us, and then we are called to reflect that gift with our own lives back into the world. Well, turning to the Hebrews reading then, with all of that in mind, the writer of the Hebrews says, let mutual love encourage. And this mutuality isn't necessarily between human beings, meaning love people who will just love you back, but let this mutuality continue between you and God. That's why sometimes people say, oh, I don't know how God can command me to love this person. Well, you can love God by the way you deal with this person, whether you like them or not. It doesn't mean you have to be friends with everyone, but it doesn't mean you have to hate everyone too. Because notice the next few things that the writer of Hebrews talks about, there's not an opportunity for mutuality, but rather that kind of banquet that Jesus says. So love strangers, he says, and in so doing you will entertain angels unknown. Visit prisoners. We talked a little bit on Thursday in our Bible study about how awful ancient prisons were, and depending on where you go in our country, how often awful some of the prisons are. Um, and that idea of going to places where the people are undeserving, or where people can't repay you, or where you have very good reasons to say, well, why would we do that? And the answer isn't mutuality back to you from the other person. The answer is mutuality from God. Well, God has done this for me, and so I will reflect into the world the love that I wish to pay to God. So sometimes, and of course this is very biblical, so it's not really even that interesting to say, sometimes you love God by loving people. And sometimes you hate God by hating people. The evangelist John is very clear on that. You can't say, oh God, I love you, and then turn around and tell everyone, oh, I hate you, you're all awful. Um, and the writer says, well, how can you love God if you've never seen God, but you've seen these people and you don't like them? Now, interestingly enough, the third example, and I think this is wonderful for us to consider, is marriage. The mutuality of marriage and the way that husbands and wives are called to love one another is a wonderful thing to add to this list, because sometimes in your marriage you don't necessarily feel like you're getting a lot from the other person or they're getting something from you, and there are times where you have to let that mutuality that God has poured into you pour into your spouse and offer them grace. And not only do they say the marriage, but they also talk about the marriage bed, leave it undefiled. So even the way you express yourself sexually, there's an important aspect of how the way God's loved you and how God used his own body on the cross affects how you use your body. And so in your relationships with other people, particularly in your marriage, and then in the marriage bed, the sexual relationship, it is not an occasion to use other people as objects, but rather to let this mutuality flourish. And so it's interesting that on this list where people can't be repaid, marriage and the act of sex are included where mutuality of love can continue. Interestingly enough, if you keep reading, the writer of Hebrews is going to talk about what we might say is going to trip up love. What is it that's going to keep you from loving mutually like God? And one of the first things he says is money. Now, money by itself means nothing. It's amoral. It has no value, moral value. But if you attach love to it and have that love before love of God and others, then it does have a problem. So the writer in Hebrews warns you that that call to mutual love will not continue if you put money in between these other relationships. Now, money can be a great tool to accomplish good ends. Like that grateful person I was talking about. We talked about that and some of the great philanthropic work that's done in our country. But that can be a warning too. Don't get greedy. Don't love the wrong thing. In this case, don't love money. And part of that loving of money ends up being or revealing a lack of trust. That sometimes when we store up too many possessions or we just start collecting money, it's a lack of trust in God. And perhaps it's one of the great ironies that on our money it says, "In God we trust." But sometimes the God we trust is the very money upon which that's printed. So the writer of Hebrews warns against lack of trust in God because then that love will start to wither. And so that's a danger in the Christian life. But then there's this beautiful saying that the Christian can offer that will kind of keep you through all sorts of difficulty. So we can say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can anyone do to me?" Now, if you can say that and mean it, and not say it as a kind of joke or irony, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid." I mean, that is the antidote to so much anxiety in the world in which we live. We're so fearful. And so oftentimes we do end up attaching our love to the wrong things because we're so fearful we won't be safe. We're so fearful we won't have enough. And this is why this is good news. No, God is with you. And so not only will you have enough, but you can give it away to people who could never repay you. And so again, that image of Jesus in the dinner from Luke. And then remember those, your leaders, those who you're called to imitate, those who spoke to you about the Word of God. Consider how they lived and what their lives showed you, and particularly those who are being martyred in the early church. Imitate their faith. So that even if you are threatened with death, violence, imprisonment, some of those people in prison were people in prison because of their faith. Imitate their faith and know that God will be with you. And then this very lovely verse that many of you already know, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. This is not an ancient promise for people not like us. This is not a promise that expired in 1517. This is a promise that was true then as it is now, as it will be. True in our living, true in our dying, true in our life again. God has made you a place at his table where you can recline, where you can dine, where you can imitate his faith and even leave your spot, your prestigious spot, and go and serve with the Lord himself. But not only that, remember that place is a gift, and so now how will you reflect that gift into the world and let your life be a sign of the gratefulness or the gratitude that comes in response to the gift we've received with life in Christ. We'll see you on Sunday.